Hey, welcome back to Drowning in Yarn. I'm Caleb. As I started to cast on this cozy classic raglan that you've heard a lot about by this point, I started to think about how the process of starting this sweater differed from the process of starting my first sweater. And I thought it might be fun to kind of just walk you through my process of starting a sweater, from picking colors and picking yarn and picking a pattern to doing a gauge swatching and casting on. My intent is not to tell you that I have a perfect process by any means, but it's just to talk about sweater knitting because I love it so much. And I figured if you love it as much as I do and you've knit a million sweaters, you probably like talking about it. And if you're new to sweater knitting, I was hoping that maybe just seeing how somebody else approaches all these little steps that seem so scary when you're new might be helpful to you, so that you're not scared for that first sweater and you jump in, because I love sweater knitting and I want everybody else to as well. So if you want to chat about sweater knitting, stick around. So for this project, I knew that I wanted to do the cozy classic raglan, so picking a pattern wasn't really something I had to think about. Though whenever I do decide to knit a sweater, especially if I just know that I'm going to knit a sweater and I need to find a pattern, or if I have a yarn in mind and I want to knit a pattern with that yarn, I kind of look for a few things. I think about what I want to get out of the project. Do I want something kind of more wild that I can kind of point to, like a skill that I learned? Typically though, I really like basics and I really like patterns that I can kind of knit while I'm still watching TV or talking to friends, because I really just like to integrate knitting into my life so that I can do it more, and so that when I'm doing those things like watching TV, I don't feel like I'm wasting time. That is really hard to do if you're kind of sticking your head in a chart and following along line by line so that you don't mess up. So I kind of like things that are a little bit more on the simple side at this point. Also, it fits better in with my style. I think if I'm trying to knit something too complex, I'm gonna not want to wear it at some point, you know, because my tastes change. But what doesn't change is how good something very simple and basic and timeless looks. And that's kind of what I'm aiming for. I spend so much time and money on all these things that I really want to be able to enjoy them for the long haul. The other thing that I always think about whenever I'm picking a pattern is what my skill level is at that time. For instance, for my first project, I knew that just knitting a sweater was enough. I didn't need to push it. I kind of always like to think about, can I do this skill that is new, and can I do it well enough that I'm not going to feel overwhelmed by the project that I'm working on? It's such a long-term project, and I would hate to be halfway into it and decide I like the way it looks, but not enough to do it, and then I want to abandon the project because you've already sunk so much time and money into it. If I'm honest with myself about my skills, then I won't take on a project that is gonna end up being incomplete. Because at the outset, I think I want to aim to have a sweater that I'll love, that fits. So I want to give myself the best chance to make that happen from the beginning. The next thing I think about is kind of the construction of the sweater, just beyond the techniques. I really like knitting sweaters in the round, seamless. That's what I've knit the most of. I just really like the construction. I enjoy the process, and I'll be honest with you, seaming scares me. I did it once on a hat with like mattress stitch. I did a terrible job. I feel like I need to practice seaming first and then maybe tackle a sweater that's knit flat and seamed. But I already know that I don't love knitting flat. I know that I'm not great at seaming, so I just don't think knitting a sweater flat is like the thing for me. I also feel like as a beginning sweater knitter, or early on in your sweater knitting career, as I still am with this is my 8th sweater, I think, I just feel like it's easier to understand the construction of a sweater knit in the round. You're really just knitting 3 tubes. What I don't necessarily understand quite as much is how to knit a sweater flat. Like, how would you knit a sweater flat and make sure it fits? And so I think until I kind of understand that process a little bit more, I might kind of shy away from that. Granted, maybe the best way to understand it is just to do it, but like I said, terrible at seaming, don't love knitting flat. So I'm just honest with myself about how I want to construct the sweater as well. So lastly, I want to understand all of the new techniques before I commit to it because I want to make sure that the process stays enjoyable for me. And if I'm not honest with myself about what goes into the sweater, what goes into making it, and if I'm not honest with myself about what I want the final project to be like, I'm going to end up with something that I'm not going to enjoy making and I'm not going to wear. And yes, I'll have gained experience, but that outcome would have been avoidable and I want to avoid it. And I think that's really the biggest takeaway is just be super honest with yourself when picking a pattern, and then you can't go wrong. So the next important step for me is picking a yarn that I want to use. In a lot of cases, I'll start with the fiber and then pick a pattern, but in this case I know that I'm knitting the Cozy Classic Raglan, so I'm starting with the pattern and need to pick a yarn that works. The best bet is often using the yarn that's called for in the pattern, because then you know that all the hard decisions have been made for you by the designer. But for me, I almost never do. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever used the yarn that's in the pattern because of availability. I really like to shop at my local yarn store so that I can feel all the yarns and see the colors true to life and know that I'm making the best decisions for myself. But sometimes I'll buy it online. And whenever I do that, there's a lot of steps that I take before I kind of pull the trigger to make sure that it's going to be a good choice for me. When I'm buying yarn online, I oftentimes will make sure that I do my due diligence in terms of going on Ravelry and reading all the comments and looking at all the projects that people have made, because I like to see how the yarn is going to look in a non-professional photo when just, some regular person is using their camera phone to take just an kind of staged photo. I also will go to Instagram for the same purpose and kind of search the hashtag for the yarn. And if I have questions, I'll reach out to whoever's posted the photo. I really wanted to try Quince & Co.'s Lark once, and so I looked at the hashtag. I realized that one of my friends made a sweater in it, and her sweater looked gorgeous. So I just kind of sent her a message and asked her what her experience was. And that made me feel more confident in ordering that yarn online without having felt it in person. And so that's one of the things that I always do, is to do a little bit of research before I make the purchase online. Now, whenever I'm picking yarns, I like to stick to a same or substantially similar fiber content. That's one of my rules of thumb for myself to help ensure that I'm going to get a finished object that is as close as possible to what the designer intended, even though I'm not using that same fiber as them. I also, in order to make sure that I'm going to have a good chance at hitting gauge, or getting close to gauge, I'll look for a fiber that's the same amount of yards per gram. That kind of just ensures that it's a similar thickness and density, which also helps make sure that it's going to be a successful substitution for me. Since I'm not super experienced at substituting different fiber types, I still shy away from that a lot, and if I were doing my first sweater, I would definitely shy away from that, but I am going to experiment with that a little bit more. If you watch one of my previous videos, which I'll provide a link to, I reviewed the Holskarn Coast, which is a wool and cotton blend. I've also really enjoyed knitting with Dapple from Brooklyn Tweed, which is also a wool and cotton blend. And so I want to use those yarns in a sweater. And because of their high wool content, I think they're both around 50% or 55%. I feel pretty confident that it's going to behave similarly to a wool in a sweater. And so I probably would feel comfortable experimenting in that direction right now. But if I did anything else, I would definitely seek out the advice of somebody who knows more than me, because I just don't know if I have the confidence to buy a yarn that isn't what I'm used to and then knit a whole project in it. I just wouldn't want to spend that time and then find out that it's not going to do what I think it's supposed to do. In this instance with my Cozy Classic Raglan, I'm sticking to wool with nylon, which I don't really think changes much. And I'm also using the mohair, but that's being held double. So I feel like the fabric properties are going to be like the wool, but maybe with the warmth of the mohair. So I feel reasonably confident using the mohair for the first time in this case. Now, whenever I've decided on a yarn and I start picking colors, that's where I kind of have a little bit more constraints on myself. Just because I'm so particular about color, I'll be honest, I used to dress like a box of crayons exploded on me. I would wear like these bright purple pants with like a bright teal shirt. It was a whole look, and I don't think that I pulled it off then, and I absolutely could not pull it off now. So I'm really conscious of making sure that I make good color choices for me. As a few general rules of thumb for myself in picking colors, I start with thinking about what's in my closet, because those are things that presumably have been worn or not been worn over time. And I want to think about why the things that go unworn are are unworn, why I don't reach for them. So I'll think about the colors in particular that I reach for all the time. For me, it's often this like army green, this like earthy, dark green. I love that color. I buy that color all the time and I wear it all the time. So I try to stick around that family whenever I'm making color choices for yarn or other things. I just know that that's going to be something that's really successful for me. However, I also have to think about what colors are overrepresented in my closet, and it's the same color, right? It's that dark earthy green. If I have everything in it, I don't want to necessarily add more of that all of the time. I still will, but I try to think about what colors I enjoy that are underrepresented, which for me would be like blue or like darker reds. I don't have those things to wear that often. Even though I say blue's my favorite color, I just don't think that's true anymore. And I really need to be honest with myself about those things, because thinking like I like one thing will lead me down this road of picking the wrong colors. I love bright colors, but I don't love wearing them on my body. So I'm gonna buy something because it's beautiful. I'm gonna spend all my time making something that's beautiful, but it's beautiful for somebody else, not for me. So this sweater is a really good example of kind of this thought process for me. I think this sweater goes against some of the like rules I set for myself that I talked about when picking a pattern. It is louder, it is less of a basic, it's beautiful, but it's probably something that won't get worn as often. And this is the Marshland from Tin Can Knit's Strange Brew book, and this was my third sweater. I do love this sweater. I think I did a good job, and I think I picked good colors. But I started at the yarn store with help, and it was excellent help. I picked out all these browns in this dark color, which are so good for me. But originally, I picked this orange because it's also beautiful. In theory, these colors were gorgeous together. I have lost my swatch, but I'll show a picture here, and you'll see that though individually these colors look gorgeous with this orange, it ended up having this really autumnal quality that looked like I could only wear it to eat pumpkin pie at Thanksgiving. And I wasn't going for that. And so I ended up with this teal color. I think it looks great. That teal is not something I would wear normally, but I do think it works because the rest of this tones it down. I just think this sweater is not a staple sweater for me. I'm so happy I made it though, because I learned so much making this sweater. And I'm grateful for this sweater, but knowing what I know now, I wouldn't make this sweater today. You'll still see me wearing it, but not that often. So I'm gonna put this aside and talk about my Cozy Classic raglan and talk about the choices that I made there. So for this sweater, I decided to also play with color a little more than I typically do. I make most often single color sweaters, but in this sweater, I knew that I wanted to make something that was a little within my color palette, my like comfort zone, but I wanted to do something also a little bit different, which is what I did with these stripes to add a little bit of visual interest. It makes knitting the sweater more interesting because there's something to pay attention to, but it also just makes it more visually interesting. But because I chose a color palette that is kind of contrasting, these stripes all have pretty high contrast, except these have like a medium low contrast. It all, when worked together with this emerald green, it really mellows out and looks cohesive and looks not loud, but it has a lot more visual interest than something that I would normally pick. So that's kind of where I was with picking colors, because I'm still in that stage, like I said, where I really want to make things that can get a lot of wear. But I also just thought I should bring in more colors since the mohair was going to kind of tone things down, so that I got a project that was outside of my comfort zone, but still within kind of the universe that I like to be of things that I'll wear again and again. Because I haven't knit that many sweaters, they're still kind of precious to me, and I really want to make sure that I'll wear them a lot. So that's kind of where the thought process was for these colors. I think every sweater that I make I love more than the last, and I'm really happy with that. I'm sure that I'll make a sweater coming up that's gonna be awful, and y'all may never see it, or maybe you will if I'm being really brave and want to show you my terrible thing. But so far that hasn't happened, because I like to be really honest with myself about what I'm gonna make. And I like to be really particular about it as well. And I think this is going to be a successful project for those reasons, as far as the pattern choice and as far as the color choices. I think it's all playing together really well, and I'm really, really excited by that. So the last thing I wanted to talk about in this video is swatching. For this sweater, I made 2 swatches, and I hate swatching. It is my least favorite part of the process, not because I don't like knitting, I obviously do, but I don't like the planning part of it whenever it involves me doing something that takes a lot of time, because once I've decided on the pattern and once I've decided on the yarn, I get so excited and all I want to do is jump in, and I feel like swatching is just this completely separate process that has nothing to do with the sweater, and that's just the wrong mindset for me to have, but I keep falling into that trap because in order to have a successful sweater, I need to swatch. So I should see those swatches as an integral part of the process and an integral part of the sweater, and I just don't all the time. I always swatch, but I don't necessarily swatch more than once. But I forced myself to do 2 substantial swatches for this sweater for a couple reasons. So let's look at those 2 swatches. So I made this swatch with the stripes first. I went ahead and did the striping in this swatch, not because I thought it was necessary to make sure that my gauge was right, but I really wanted to confirm that my color choices were gonna work. Like I showed you with my marshland sweater, swatching with those colors really gives you a better idea of how the colors are gonna play together in reality. And in this case, it was successful. I loved it from, the first color change. And so that aspect worked. I really like the fabric on this swatch. However, with this gauge, I was not going to be successful in achieving the size that I wanted. So then I swatched again with a larger needle. And when I was knitting this swatch, which I did only in one color because I had already confirmed that my colors were going to work the way that I wanted them to, I was really worried because to me, it looked at first like it was just going to be this really loose fabric. It was going to be like a mesh, and I didn't want that, but I blocked it, which I always do because you never know what the yarn's going to do after blocking, and it came out perfect. I was spot on with the patterns gauge, and so I stopped. Like I said, I sometimes only do 1 because I'll be successful on that first try, not at getting the gauge that the pattern calls for, but at achieving a fabric I like. And in that case, if I'm close enough on gauge, I can play with the gauge a little bit to knit a different size in the pattern that will end up the size that I want. So this swatch is also a really good point to talk about something that I fall into every single time. I always knit the garter stitch edge to just keep it from curling. Then I knit the swatch, which I do in stockinette because my sweaters are always just stockinette, and I just do a speed swatch. So if you don't know how to do that, I'll definitely include a link for a tutorial on that. But I'll oftentimes start knitting in stockinette, knit like an inch, and then say, I'm sick of this, and measure. And that measurement is a lie because whenever it's not bound off and whenever it's not complete, it's spread out more, right? And so I do that every time. I freak out every time. And then I tell myself, just keep knitting. And I'll knit my swatch, oftentimes only like 2 inches high. This is a big swatch for me. And then I'll knit more garter stitch edge, bind it off. I force myself to block it. I'll put it in the water, let it soak for like 30 minutes or a couple hours if I forget it. And then I take it out, put it in a towel or like a washcloth if it's small, get out as much water as I can, like roll it up, stomp on it, or press my whole body weight on it, get all the water out. And then I'll put it in front of a fan or on my radiator in the winter, just so it will dry in like an hour or 2. And then I measure it, and then I usually get started knitting. And that takes so much patience for me because I am not a patient person and I just want to knit. And that always results in a swatch that tells me the truth. And in order to make sure that I get a good measurement, I try my best to get it in the middle because on the edges it can kind of fib to you a little bit and tell you a gauge that's different. So I make sure I measure in a couple places, and if it's like wildly different, I'll think about why am I too close to the edge, whatever. Make sure that I'm getting kind of the same measurement in a couple different places just to confirm that that's the real gauge. And then I can start knitting, and that's my favorite part. I think my biggest opportunity where swatching is concerned, as I've said, I have the wrong mindset about it, is just to like swatch and swatch again, which I did this time, and I'm really happy because I'm both really happy with the fabric and spot on with gauge, which makes knitting it a little bit easier because I didn't have to do any extra math or anything. But just reminding myself that it's okay to swatch and swatch again is like a good process. It also helps me be a little bit less of a project knitter, which I am almost to a fault and really enjoy the process and like the mindfulness of the process, because these are just as important as this is, and I need to remember that, and I don't always. But that's all I have to say about swatching right now, just kind of the process of doing it. And if you want to see how I take these swatches and pick my size, stick around for my next video because I'm going to talk about it there. In order to be notified when that video comes out, if you're not already subscribed, definitely hit the subscribe button below and hit the little bell to get notifications. I have loved chatting with y'all today about this cozy classic raglan. I hope if you're new, you kind of picked up some insights into how somebody else might think about the process. And I hope if you're a really experienced sweater knitter, you've just enjoyed talking about sweater knitting, definitely comment below and tell me where your process differs than mine or where my process can be improved, because I would love to gain some insight from you experienced sweater knitters. Or let me know what questions you still have or what scares you about sweater knitting, because I want everybody to love sweater knitting as much as me. And so to the extent that I can help alleviate those fears for people, I want to do it. But it's been really fun chatting with y'all, and I can't wait to talk more about sweaters next time. So I'll see y'all later.